When Dieter Hoffmann crossed the border at Checkpoint Charlie in 1978, he carried nothing but a small suitcase and the clothes on his back. What stunned the 32-year-old factory worker from Dresden wasn't the bright neon lights of West Berlin or the stock shop windows, it was the parking lots. Row after row of gleaming automobiles, not just Volkswagens but Mercedes, BMWs, Opels, and even foreign makes like Renaults and Fiats. I stood there frozen, he later recalled in his memoirs. In my neighborhood in Dresden, perhaps one family in 20 owned a car. Here, it seemed every family owned two. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The tale of the two Germanys, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, in the East and the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, in the West, represents one of history's most stark natural experiments in competing economic systems. By the late 1970s, these two nations, born from the same cultural and historical roots, had diverged so dramatically that citizens like Dieter could scarcely believe what they witnessed when crossing the border. The automobile emerged as perhaps the most visible and psychologically significant symbol of this divergence. In East Germany, the waiting list for the iconic Trabant, affectionately nicknamed Trabi, stretched to 15 years by 1980. The small, boxy vehicle with its two-stroke engine producing just 26 horsepower had barely changed since its introduction in 1957. Constructed with a body made of Duraplast, a plastic material reinforced with cotton or wool fibers, often erroneously described as cardboard, the Trabant represented both the achievement and limitation of East German industry. It offered basic transportation, but little more. Meanwhile, across the border, West Germans were not only buying cars, but upgrading them regularly. By 1975, car ownership had reached 330 vehicles per 1,000 inhabitants in West Germany, compared to just 138 per 1,000 in East Germany. More significantly, West German families increasingly owned second vehicles, a concept so foreign to East Germans that it entered their collective consciousness as a symbol of unimaginable prosperity. How did two parts of the same nation, separated for just 3 decades, develop such dramatically different standards of living? The answer lies in the divergent economic systems imposed after World War II and the cascading effects they produced across every aspect of daily life. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, both Germanys faced similar devastation. The Allied bombing campaigns had reduced major cities to rubble. Industrial capacity lay in ruins. Millions were displaced, hungry, and traumatized. Yet from these similar starting points, two fundamentally different societies would emerge. The Western zones eventually united as the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, embraced what would become known as the social market economy, Soziale Marktwirtschaft, under the guidance of Economic Minister Ludwig Erhard. This approach combined free market principles with government regulation and social welfare programs, a third way between unfettered capitalism and state socialism. The currency reform of 1948, which introduced the Deutsche Mark, eliminated price controls, and wiped out 90% of currency holdings, created significant short-term hardship, but laid the groundwork for West Germany's economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder. In the Soviet occupation zone, which became the German Democratic Republic, a very different system took shape. Following the Soviet model, the East German government implemented a centrally planned economy. Private businesses were nationalized, agriculture was collectivized, and 5-year plans dictated production goals. Individual consumption was subordinated to industrial development and ideological imperatives. By the early 1970s, these divergent paths had produced starkly different realities. West Germany had become Europe's economic powerhouse, with a GDP per capita more than double that of East Germany. West German workers enjoyed not only higher wages, but also access to a vast array of consumer goods. Meanwhile, East Germans faced chronic shortages of everything from coffee to toilet paper, with the automobile representing the ultimate luxury good. The Interministerial Council for Motor Vehicles in East Germany strictly controlled automobile production and distribution. State planners allocated resources to heavy industry and military production first, viewing consumer goods as secondary. The resulting scarcity created a peculiar relationship between East Germans and their cars. Owning a Trabant or the slightly more upscale Wartburg became not just a matter of transportation, but of social status and personal identity. A car wasn't just a car in the GDR, explained former East German citizen Martina Weber in an oral history interview conducted in 1998. It was your freedom, your ticket to weekend escapes, your most valuable possession. People who owned Trabants modified them, repaired them themselves, treated them like members of the family. You couldn't just go buy another one if something went wrong. This scarcity generated remarkable ingenuity. East German drivers became expert mechanics by necessity. They formed informal networks to exchange parts and expertise. Modifications and personalizations were common, giving each vehicle a unique character despite their outwardly identical appearance. The Trabant, with its simplistic design and mechanical reliability, was particularly suited to home maintenance. Its two-stroke engine had just 5 moving parts and could be repaired with basic tools. Meanwhile, in West Germany, the automobile industry represented the crown jewel of the economic miracle. Companies like Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Opel produced vehicles not just for the domestic market, but for export worldwide. The industry employed hundreds of thousands directly and millions more indirectly through suppliers and services. Car ownership became democratized, spreading from the wealthy to the middle class and even to working-class families. By 1980, the automobile landscape in West Germany had diversified remarkably. Families increasingly specialized their vehicle choices, perhaps a practical Volkswagen Golf for daily commuting and a more luxurious model for weekend trips. Foreign manufacturers, from Italian Fiats to Japanese Toyotas, competed in the German market. Car dealerships lined suburban streets, offering financing options and trade-in programs that made regular upgrades possible. The contrast in production methods told its own story. The Trabant factory in Zwickau used largely the same equipment and processes from the 1950s through the 1980s. Annual production peaked at around 100,000 vehicles. Automation was limited, and substantial manual labor was required at each stage of assembly. The factory itself, built before World War II, struggled with outdated infrastructure and limited capacity for modernization. In West Germany, companies like Volkswagen pioneered automated manufacturing techniques. The Wolfsburg plant, VW's flagship facility, produced over 1 million vehicles annually by the late 1970s. Robots handled welding and painting operations, computer systems tracked inventory and production flow, and assembly lines incorporated the latest ergonomic principles to increase worker productivity and safety. This divergence extended to the driving experience itself. East German roads remained largely as they had been before World War II, narrow, often unpaved outside major cities, with limited signage and safety features. Service stations were sparse and fuel shortages common. Drivers carried extra gasoline in canisters for long journeys, never certain if the next station would have supplies. West German drivers, by contrast, enjoyed the expanding Autobahn network, over 5,000 kilometers of high-speed highways by 1980. Service areas offered fuel, food, and mechanical assistance around the clock. Roadside emergency phones appeared every 2 kilometers. Navigation became easier with standardized signage and regularly updated maps. The entire infrastructure supported and encouraged automobile ownership and travel. Perhaps most tellingly, the relationship between citizens and their vehicles reflected deeper differences in each society's economic philosophy. In West Germany, cars represented consumer choice and personal expression. Advertisements emphasized performance, styling, and the emotional benefits of ownership. Automobiles were viewed as products to be regularly upgraded as technologies improved and personal circumstances changed. In East Germany, the state-controlled media rarely advertised automobiles, focusing instead on their utilitarian functions and the collective achievement they represented. Waiting lists, not marketing campaigns, drove demand. When East Germans finally received the call that their Trabant was ready, often a decade after placing their order, the event was cause for major celebration, documented in family photographs and commemorated with parties. These divergent car cultures produced different social dynamics as well. West German drivers developed a reputation for assertiveness on the road, particularly on the Autobahn, where speed limits were often advisory rather than mandatory. The ability to drive fast became associated with personal freedom and technical prowess. Car clubs and enthusiast communities formed around specific makes and models. East German drivers, constrained by their vehicles' limitations and fuel scarcity, developed a more collaborative approach. Hitchhiking remained common well into the 1980s, with drivers expected to pick up pedestrians when space allowed. Carpooling for work commutes was nearly universal. Drivers supported each other with roadside assistance, knowing that official help might be hours away or unavailable entirely. The Berlin Wall, which physically divided the two Germanys from 1961, created a psychological barrier that made these differences seem even more profound. East Germans could see Western television broadcasts showing advertisements for the latest models, but had no way to experience them firsthand. West Germans, when permitted to visit relatives in the East, arrived in vehicles that represented technological advancement and prosperity. When my West German cousins visited in their BMW, the entire neighborhood came out to look at it, recalled Hans Schmidt, who grew up in Leipzig during the 1970s. Children asked to sit behind the wheel. Adults examined every detail. It was like a spaceship had landed on our street. Their car cost more than my father would earn in 10 years. By the mid-1980s, the automobile gap had become a potent symbol of the broader economic disparity between East and West. The average age of cars in East Germany exceeded 15 years, compared to approximately 6 years in West Germany. The Trabant's basic design remained largely unchanged for over 3 decades, while Western manufacturers introduced new models with significant technological improvements every few years. The environmental impact of this divergence proved equally stark. The Trabant's two-stroke engine produced copious amounts of visible pollution, a distinctive blue smoke that became emblematic of Eastern European cities. Without catalytic converters or other emissions controls, each Trabant released as much pollution as 30 to 40 West German cars equipped with the latest environmental technologies. In retrospect, the automobile disparity represented more than just different consumption possibilities. It reflected fundamentally different conceptions of the role of consumer goods in society. The West German economic model prioritized consumer satisfaction as both an end in itself and as a driver of innovation and growth. The East German model subordinated consumer desires to ideological goals and central planning priorities. These different approaches extended to the workplace as well. West German auto workers, represented by powerful unions, secured high wages, reduced working hours, and extensive benefits. By the late 1970s, IG Metall, the metalworkers union, had negotiated the 35-hour workweek for its members. Auto workers often lived in single-family homes in suburban communities, commuting to work in their own vehicles. East German workers at the Trabant and Wartburg factories faced very different conditions. Housing consisted primarily of state-constructed apartment blocks, often with inadequate maintenance and limited amenities. Workers typically used public transportation or bicycles for their commutes, as their own production rarely prioritized employee car ownership. While officially these workers owned the means of production through the socialist state, in practice They had little influence over working conditions or production decisions. For families, these automobile differences shaped daily life in countless ways. West German families could spontaneously decide on weekend trips to the countryside or neighboring countries. Shopping for groceries or other necessities could be accomplished efficiently by car, allowing for bulk purchases and comparison shopping among different stores. Children could be driven to specialized schools, sports activities, or social events. East German families with limited access to private transportation developed different patterns. Shopping occurred more frequently but in smaller quantities at local stores within walking distance. Children typically attended the nearest school and participated in state-organized youth activities in their immediate neighborhood. Vacations required extensive advance planning, often utilizing the state-subsidized vacation system rather than independent travel. The psychological impact of these differences cannot be overstated. For East Germans, glimpses of Western automobile culture through television, occasional visits from Western relatives, or rare opportunities to travel to the West created a profound sense of material deprivation. The knowledge that their counterparts across the border, people with the same language, cultural heritage, and historical background, enjoyed seemingly unlimited mobility and consumer choice, generated both desire and resentment. Stasi, East German Secret Police, reports from the period regularly documented citizen complaints about automobile scarcity. One confidential assessment from 1977 noted, "Discussions about the availability of personal vehicles represent the single most common expression of economic dissatisfaction among the population. Citizens frequently compare their situation unfavorably to that in the FRG, citing Western television broadcasts showing multiple car ownership as evidence of superior living standards." The East German government responded to this discontent with a mix of propaganda and incremental improvements. Official media emphasized the social costs of West German car mania, traffic accidents, environmental damage, and the atomization of communities. The automobile was portrayed as a symbol of capitalist excess and materialistic values, contrasted with the more collective orientation of socialist transportation policy. At the same time, the government did attempt to increase production and improve the quality of domestic vehicles. The introduction of the Trabant 601 in 1964 represented a significant advance over previous models, though it would remain essentially unchanged for the next 25 years. Plans for more advanced models were repeatedly developed, but faltered due to resource constraints and political priorities. By the late 1970s, the East German leadership recognized the political necessity of improving consumer access to automobiles. The waiting list system was reformed to prioritize certain groups: families with children, workers who had demonstrated exceptional productivity, and those with specialized needs related to their employment. While this addressed some specific cases, it did little to reduce overall wait times and created new perceptions of unfairness. Limited imports from other Eastern Bloc countries provided some diversity in the East German car market. The Soviet Lada, Czechoslovakian Škoda, and Polish Fiat 126P offered alternatives to domestic models, though they too required years of waiting and often cost significantly more than the Trabant. These vehicles were typically allocated to higher-ranking party officials, successful athletes, and others the regime wished to reward. For the average East German citizen, the automobile remained an aspiration rather than an expectation. The intense desire for car ownership manifested in various cultural forms, from popular jokes about Trabant waiting times, by the time your car arrives, your children will be old enough to drive it, to the development of an entire automotive subculture centered on maintaining and customizing the limited options available. This scarcity created significant second-order effects throughout the economy. Black market trading in auto parts became widespread, diverting resources from state-controlled distribution channels. Citizens with technical skills could earn substantial informal income through automotive repairs and modifications. Foreign currency, particularly West German Deutsche Marks, became highly valued for its ability to purchase automotive components unavailable through official sources. The two-car family, common in West Germany by the late 1970s, represented a particularly potent symbol of prosperity that transcended mere transportation. It signified not just wealth, but freedom of choice and individualization of lifestyle. Families could own vehicles suited to different purposes, perhaps a practical sedan for daily commuting and a recreational vehicle for leisure activities. This specialization of function was entirely foreign to East German automotive culture, where simply having one reliable vehicle represented a major achievement. West German advertising exploited this desire for specialization and status differentiation. Marketing campaigns increasingly segmented the market, targeting specific demographic groups with vehicles designed to reflect their self-image and aspirations. Young professionals might be drawn to sporty BMWs, established executives to prestigious Mercedes models, environmentally conscious consumers to fuel-efficient innovations. This diversity of options created a complex automotive hierarchy that communicated social position and personal values. For East Germans able to visit the West, automobile showrooms became tourist attractions in themselves. They wandered through these spaces not as potential customers, but as observers of an alien consumer culture. The ability to simply walk into a dealership and purchase a new vehicle without waiting lists, without political connections, without years of saving, seemed almost incomprehensible. Wolfgang Berghofer, who would later become mayor of Dresden during the final years of the GDR, described his first visit to a West German car dealership in 1986. "I stood there watching ordinary people, not party officials or factory directors, just average citizens, discussing features and financing terms for vehicles that would cost a decade's wages in East Germany. The salesman asked if I wanted to test drive something. I didn't know how to explain that I was just there to look, to witness this miracle of abundance that seemed like science fiction to us." As the 1980s progressed, the automobile gap between East and West Germany continued to widen. West German manufacturers pioneered technologies like anti-lock braking systems, electronic fuel injection, and computerized engine management. Design evolved rapidly with aerodynamic considerations, improving both performance and efficiency. Safety features multiplied, from crumple zones to airbags, as regulatory standards increased and consumer expectations evolved. The Trabant, meanwhile, soldiered on with essentially the same technology it had featured since the 1960s. Minor cosmetic updates and incremental improvements could not disguise its increasingly obsolete design. Plans for a successor model with a four-stroke engine were perpetually delayed by economic constraints. East German engineers understood perfectly well what modern automotive technology required, but the resources to implement these insights remained unavailable. This technological stagnation epitomized the broader economic challenges facing the East German state. Unable to keep pace with Western innovation across multiple industries, the country found itself caught in a downward spiral of decreasing competitiveness and mounting debt. The very model of central planning that had enabled rapid industrialization in the 1950s proved increasingly ill-suited to the complex, dynamic economy of the late 20th century. The automobile divergence between East and West Germany reflected not just different levels of prosperity, but different conceptions of the relationship between citizens and the state. In West Germany, consumer sovereignty, the idea that individual purchasing decisions should drive production priorities, became an article of faith. The automobile industry responded to market demand, producing vehicles that consumers wanted at prices they were willing to pay. In East Germany, production priorities reflected political decisions rather than consumer preferences. Resources allocated to automobile manufacturing had to be justified in terms of broader social and economic goals, export potential, employment maintenance, or symbolic value. The extensive waiting lists for vehicles demonstrated unmet consumer demand, but this signal could not effectively influence production decisions within the centrally planned system. By 1988, the contradictions of the East German approach had become unsustainable. Citizens increasingly compared their material circumstances not to the immediate post-war period, when any improvement seemed remarkable, but to the contemporary prosperity visible across the border. The automobile gap served as a daily reminder of these differences, visible in traffic patterns, parking lots, and the very landscape of both countries. Harold Wagner, who worked as a mechanical engineer in Karl-Marx-Stadt, now Chemnitz, recalled the growing frustration among his colleagues during this period. We had the technical knowledge to design better vehicles. We understood what needed to be done, but every proposal for modernization met the same response. Where will the investment come from? Where will we get the hard currency for Western components? We watched our designs gather dust while our factories continued producing technology from the 1950s. It was professionally humiliating. The dichotomy in automotive experiences extended beyond technical specifications to encompass the entire infrastructure supporting car ownership. In West Germany, a comprehensive ecosystem had developed, from driving schools to insurance companies, from specialized automotive media to aftermarket accessory businesses. Car ownership generated its own economy, with hundreds of thousands of jobs in sales, service, and support functions. In East Germany, this ecosystem remained rudimentary, with most services provided by the state or through informal networks. The language surrounding automobiles diverged as well. West German car culture developed its own specialized vocabulary, technical terms, brand-specific jargon, marketing language that reflected the diversity and complexity of the market. East German automotive language remained more practical and standardized, focused on the limited range of available models and the common challenges of maintenance and repair. Even the aesthetic experience of driving differed dramatically. West German roads were increasingly bordered by sophisticated advertising billboards, many featuring automotive products. Service stations developed into small commercial centers with restaurants, shops, and entertainment. The driving environment itself communicated prosperity and commercial vitality. East German roads, by contrast, featured political slogans rather than commercial advertisements. Service stations remained utilitarian, offering minimal amenities. The landscape through which drivers traveled reflected the state's priorities: industrial development, collective achievement, political messaging, rather than consumer appeal or commercial opportunity. This aesthetic divergence extended to the vehicles themselves. By the 1980s, West German automobile design had evolved through multiple generations, incorporating influences from Italian, American, and Japanese styling trends. Vehicles featured increasingly distinctive brand identities, with careful attention to both exterior appearance and interior comfort. Materials, colors, and finishes were selected to enhance the sensory experience of ownership. The Trabant and other Eastern Bloc vehicles remained frozen in an earlier aesthetic era. Their boxy, utilitarian designs prioritized manufacturing simplicity over style or comfort. Interior materials were chosen for durability and cost rather than tactile appeal. The sensory experience of driving, from engine noise to seat comfort to dashboard controls, remained essentially unchanged for decades, even as Western expectations continually evolved. For many East Germans, particularly those born after the construction of the Berlin Wall, these differences were known primarily through second-hand sources, Western television broadcasts, stories from relatives with permission to travel, or the occasional Western visitor. Yet even this indirect knowledge created profound dissatisfaction as citizens recognized that their material circumstances reflected not inevitable economic realities, but political choices that had placed them at a disadvantage. Günter Mittag, the Central Committee Secretary for Economic Affairs in East Germany from 1976 to 1989, recognized this psychological impact. In a confidential memo to party leadership in 1985, he warned, "The disparity in personal vehicle availability between our republic and the FRG has become a primary source of political discontent, particularly among younger citizens. Despite our ideological emphasis on collective transportation solutions, the private automobile has attained a symbolic importance that transcends its practical function. We must develop realistic strategies to address this issue or face increasing dissatisfaction." The regime's attempts to address this dissatisfaction took various forms. Production of the Trabant was modestly increased, though never to levels that could significantly reduce waiting times. Quality control received greater emphasis, attempting to reduce the maintenance burden on owners. Limited resources were allocated to developing a new model with improved performance and reduced emissions, though progress remained painfully slow. Parallel to these production efforts, the regime also attempted to reshape citizen expectations through propaganda and education. School textbooks emphasized the environmental and social benefits of public transportation over private car ownership. Media reports highlighted traffic congestion and accident rates in Western cities as the inevitable consequence of excessive automobile ownership. The socialist transportation system was presented as a rational, efficient alternative to the individualistic chaos of Western car culture. These efforts at expectation management achieved limited success. By the late 1980s, the desire for personal mobility had become too deeply entrenched to be dislodged by ideological arguments. Younger East Germans in particular, having grown up watching Western television and hearing stories of life beyond the wall, increasingly viewed the automobile situation as emblematic of the broader failures of the socialist system. The connection between automobile access and political loyalty became increasingly apparent to the regime. Party officials, successful athletes, cultural figures, and others whose support was valued received preferential treatment in vehicle allocation. This approach, while securing the loyalty of key individuals, further undermined the system's legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary citizens who saw political connections rather than genuine need determining access to scarce resources. At a practical level, the automobile gap shaped daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. West Germans increasingly structured their lives around the assumption of personal mobility, choosing housing in suburban areas, shopping at larger stores with parking facilities, maintaining social connections across greater distances. East Germans, constrained by limited transportation options, developed more localized patterns of living, working, and socializing. These different lifestyles created what might be called different geographies of opportunity. West Germans could reasonably consider job opportunities, educational programs, or social activities within a radius of many kilometers from their homes. East Germans, particularly those without personal vehicles, found their effective radius much more constrained, limiting access to advancement opportunities and experiences. The automobile thus became not just a symbol of prosperity, but an actual mechanism through which different life possibilities were created and maintained. The family with 2 cars could optimize their use of time and resources in ways impossible for those dependent on limited public transportation or infrequent access to shared vehicles. This practical advantage compounded over time, creating divergent life trajectories from seemingly minor differences in daily convenience. As the 1980s drew to a close, the automobile situation in East Germany had become emblematic of the broader economic crisis facing the socialist system. Despite decades of promises about eventual prosperity, the gap in living standards, most visibly represented by automobile access, had only widened. Citizens increasingly questioned not just the efficiency, but the basic legitimacy of a system that could not deliver on its fundamental promises. In this context, the automobile emerged as a powerful symbol of freedom in multiple senses, not just the practical freedom of movement, but the broader freedom to make consumer choices, to express individual preferences, to participate in modernity as experienced by other developed nations. When protesters took to the streets in 1989, their demands encompassed not just political liberties, but material improvements, with the automobile representing both. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in November 1989, one of the most enduring images was the parade of Trabants crossing the border into West Germany. Tiny, smoky vehicles that embodied both the limitations of the East German system and the determination of its people. The automobile, which had symbolized the division between East and West for decades, now became a vehicle of reunification, carrying citizens across a boundary that had once seemed permanent. The immediate aftermath of the border opening created unprecedented automotive encounters. Trabant drivers found themselves navigating West German highways alongside Mercedes sports cars moving at twice their top speed. West German parking lots filled with the distinctive shapes of Eastern vehicles, their two-stroke engines audible from blocks away. For many East Germans, these first drives across the border represented their most tangible experience of reunification, the physical journey across previously impassable boundaries. Petra Müller, who drove her family's Trabant from Leipzig to Hamburg in December 1989, described this journey. "We felt simultaneously proud and embarrassed in our little Trabi. Proud because it had faithfully served us for years despite all its limitations. Embarrassed because Western drivers stared at us like we were driving a lawnmower on the highway. I remember my husband trying to keep up with traffic, the engine screaming at 100 kilometers per hour, while BMWs and Mercedes flew past us. It was exhilarating and humiliating at the same time. The joy of these initial crossings soon gave way to more complex emotions. East German vehicles became objects of curiosity, amusement, and sometimes derision in the West. The Trabant, once a prized possession representing years of waiting and saving, was suddenly revealed as technologically primitive by Western standards. A car that had symbolized status and achievement within the GDR context became, almost overnight, a rolling emblem of the failed East German economic system. This transformation was particularly painful for East German citizens who had invested significant portions of their lives and savings in acquiring and maintaining their vehicles. Cars that had been valued at 30,000 East German marks before the wall fell could barely be given away by 1991. The rapid currency union between East and West, with the Deutsche Mark replacing the East German mark, accelerated this devaluation, making Western vehicles suddenly affordable while rendering Eastern models effectively worthless. Manfred Schmidt, who had received his Trabant just 6 months before the wall fell, after a 12-year wait, expressed the psychological impact. "I had spent more than a third of my life waiting for this car. I had saved every month. I had learned everything about maintaining it. Then, suddenly, it was worth nothing. People were abandoning their Trabants in Berlin streets because parking them cost more than they were worth. It felt like my life's achievement had turned to dust." As reunification proceeded, the entire East German automotive industry faced existential challenges. The Trabant factory in Zwickau produced its last vehicle in April 1991, ending a 34-year production run. The slightly more advanced Wartburg ceased production in the same year. Neither could compete in an open market against Western models, nor could they meet the stringent emissions and safety standards that now applied to the reunified Germany. For the approximately 3 million Trabant owners in the former East Germany, this transition created practical as well as psychological challenges. Parts became increasingly difficult to find as supply chains disintegrated. Service knowledge specific to these vehicles diminished as mechanics retrained to work on Western models. Insurance and registration costs rose to Western levels, while the vehicles themselves plummeted in value. The statistics tell the story of this rapid transformation. In 1989, more than 90% of private vehicles in East Germany were domestically produced or from other Eastern Bloc countries. By 1995, this figure had dropped below 20%. The West German automotive infrastructure, dealerships, service centers, parts suppliers, expanded rapidly into the former East, creating a unified car market where Western models predominated. Many East Germans abandoned their Trabants and Wartburgs as quickly as possible, trading up to used Western vehicles, often older Volkswagens, Opels, or Fords that nevertheless represented significant technological improvements. Others, whether from financial necessity or nostalgia, continued driving their Eastern vehicles as long as possible, forming clubs and support networks to maintain a diminishing fleet. The automotive transformation symbolized the broader challenges of German reunification, the rapid introduction of Western economic structures, while delivering immediate consumer benefits, also resulted in massive deindustrialization in the East. Factories that could not compete in the open market closed, creating unemployment and economic dislocation. The anticipated convergence of living standards proceeded more slowly and unevenly than many had hoped. The collapse of the East German automotive industry reflected this broader pattern. At its peak, the Trabant factory in Zwickau had employed over 10,000 workers directly, with tens of thousands more in supplier companies. The rapid transition to market competition eliminated many of these jobs, contributing to unemployment rates that reached 30% in some eastern regions during the early 1990s. Volkswagen's decision to establish a new plant at the former Trabant factory site in Zwickau represented one of the more successful industrial transitions. Beginning with assembly of Western models like the Polo and Golf, the facility gradually expanded as workers adapted to Western production methods and quality standards. Yet even this success story involved substantial workforce reductions and painful adjustments for the surrounding community. The human stories behind these statistics reveal both resilience and disorientation. Former Trabant assembly line workers found themselves navigating unfamiliar job markets, often requiring retraining or relocation. Automotive engineers who had spent careers working around the limitations of the planned economy now applied their problem-solving skills in the context of market competition. Klaus Weber, who had worked as a design engineer at the Trabant factory for 20 years, described this transition. Before reunification, our challenge was creating solutions with extremely limited resources, making a functioning car from whatever materials were available. After reunification, the challenge became understanding Western consumer expectations and competitive pressures. We went from asking, how can we make this work at all, to how can we make this appealing to customers with many choices? This professional reorientation paralleled the broader cultural adjustments facing East Germans. Citizens who had developed specialized knowledge for navigating the shortage economy, knowing which officials to befriend, which distribution channels to monitor, how to trade favors for access, found these skills suddenly obsolete. New competencies were required: understanding financing options, evaluating competing products, negotiating purchases, and maintaining personal credit ratings. The cultural meaning of automobile ownership evolved as well. East Germans who had viewed cars primarily as scarce functional goods now encountered Western automotive culture with its emphasis on brand identity, status signaling, and regular model upgrades. Some embraced this consumer-oriented approach, while others maintained a more utilitarian relationship with their vehicles, viewing Western marketing efforts with skepticism. This skepticism extended to other aspects of Western automotive culture. The high-speed driving common on the Autobahn, where segments remained without speed limits, seemed reckless to many East Germans accustomed to vehicles that struggled to exceed 100 kilometers per hour. The practice of financing vehicle purchases through loans rather than saving the full amount in advance contradicted deeply ingrained financial habits. Thomas Kraus, who worked as a tax advisor in Leipzig after reunification, observed these different approaches among his clients. Eastern Germans who'd grown up in the GDR often continued driving the same car for 15 or 20 years, maintaining it meticulously. They viewed Western-style consumer behavior, trading up every few years, always wanting the latest model, as wasteful and somewhat suspicious. They'd ask, Why replace something that still works? This questioning of consumer culture reflected broader concerns about the values and priorities of the unified German society. Many East Germans had internalized aspects of socialist ideology that criticized excessive consumption as wasteful and environmentally damaging, while few wished to return to the scarcity of the GDR era. Many also expressed ambivalence about the consumer-driven lifestyle that had replaced it. The automobile also featured prominently in the phenomenon of Ostalgie, nostalgia for aspects of East German life that developed during the 1990s and 2000s. The Trabant, once a symbol of scarcity and technological backwardness, underwent a cultural rehabilitation as a beloved icon of a shared past. Trabant clubs formed throughout Germany, restoration projects flourished, and the vehicles became collector's items, appreciated now for their historical significance and quirky character, rather than their practical utility. This nostalgic reappraisal found its expression in popular culture as well. The 2003 film Goodbye Lenin featured a light blue Trabant prominently, treating the vehicle with affection rather than derision. Museums dedicated to everyday life in the former GDR invariably included Trabants among their most prominent exhibits. Tourist attractions in Berlin offered visitors the opportunity to drive the iconic cars, experiencing a small taste of East German automotive reality. The Trabant's journey from object of necessity to object of nostalgia reflected the complex emotional processing of the East German past. As the immediate hardships of transition faded, many former citizens found themselves reevaluating aspects of their previous lives, not necessarily wishing to return to socialism, but recognizing elements of community, security, and shared experience that had been lost in the rapid transition to capitalism. Stefan Wolle, historian and curator at the GDR Museum in Berlin, explained this evolution. In the immediate aftermath of reunification, many East Germans wanted to distance themselves from symbols of the old system, the Trabant included. But as time passed, these objects became vessels for more complex memories, representing not just the limitations of the socialist system, but also genuine achievements, social connections, and shared experiences under difficult circumstances. Beyond these cultural reconsiderations, the automobile gap between East and West Germany left lasting legacies in infrastructure, urban development, and transportation patterns. Eastern cities, designed around lower levels of car ownership, featured broader sidewalks, more extensive public transportation networks, and higher population densities than their Western counterparts. As car ownership rates converged after reunification, these cities faced challenges accommodating increased traffic volumes and parking demand. The environmental implications proved equally significant. The replacement of millions of highly polluting two-stroke engines with modern vehicles produced immediate air quality improvements in eastern cities. Visible smog decreased dramatically, and the characteristic smell of burning two-stroke oil mixture, once a defining feature of East German urban environments, faded from daily experience. Yet increased automobile ownership also created new environmental challenges. Traffic congestion worsened as eastern roads designed for limited vehicle numbers suddenly carried Western-level traffic volumes. Expanded car ownership reduced public transit ridership in some areas, threatening the viability of systems that had previously served as the transportation backbone of eastern cities. Urban planners and environmental advocates faced difficult questions about how to balance increased mobility demands with sustainability concerns. The East German approach, limiting private vehicle ownership through scarcity and emphasizing public transportation, had produced environmental benefits alongside significant limitations on personal freedom. The West German model, prioritizing individual mobility and consumer choice, created different environmental challenges despite technological advantages in emissions control. Professor Dieter Hoffmann of the Technical University of Dresden, who studied transportation systems in both pre- and post-reunification Germany, observed, The irony is that East Germany's transportation system, for all its limitations, embodied some principles that contemporary urban planners now promote: density, public transit orientation, mixed-use development. These weren't conscious environmental choices, but consequences of resource limitations. After reunification, we experienced a pendulum swing toward the Western model of car-centered development, before gradually recognizing the need for more balanced approaches. For individuals who had experienced both systems, the psychological adjustment continued long after the practical transition to Western-style automobile ownership. The ability to simply purchase a car without waiting lists, without political considerations, remained remarkable even years after reunification. The need to choose among dozens of makes and models, to evaluate financing options, to consider features and accessories. These decisions required a consumer mindset that developed gradually. Christiane Müller, who grew up in East Berlin and later became a journalist documenting the reunification process, described this adjustment. For my parents' generation, buying their first Western car was simultaneously liberating and overwhelming. They'd spent decades in a system where consumer choice was severely limited, where you took what was available and were grateful to get it. Suddenly they faced endless options, aggressive salespeople, and complex financing arrangements. It required learning an entirely new set of skills and attitudes. For younger East Germans who came of age during or after reunification, the automobile culture converged more quickly with Western patterns. Those who never experienced the waiting list for a Trabant adopted Western consumer behaviors more readily, though often influenced by their parents' more cautious approach to consumption and debt. By the early 2000s, visible differences in the automotive landscape between former East and West had diminished significantly. Car ownership rates had largely converged, with approximately 550 vehicles per 1,000 inhabitants throughout unified Germany. Brand preferences showed regional variations, but the overall market structure reflected national rather than East-West patterns. The transition from a two-car system to a unified automotive culture appeared largely complete, yet subtler differences persisted beneath this surface convergence. Surveys consistently showed that residents of the former East purchased new vehicles less frequently, chose more economical models, and kept their cars longer than their Western counterparts. These patterns reflected both ongoing economic disparities — average incomes in Eastern states remained lower — and persistent differences in consumer attitudes shaped by different historical experiences. The automotive infrastructure similarly reflected this incomplete convergence. The density of car dealerships, service centers, and specialized automotive businesses remained lower in Eastern states. Road quality, while dramatically improved from GDR levels, still lagged behind Western standards in many rural areas. The Autobahn network, though extended into Eastern territories, remained less comprehensive than in the West. Perhaps most significantly, the memory of automobile scarcity continued to shape political attitudes and expectations. Eastern voters remained more sensitive to policies affecting car affordability and access, from fuel taxes to parking regulations to public transportation investments. Politicians learned that automotive policies carried different symbolic weight in Eastern constituencies, where car ownership represented not just convenience but hard-won participation in a prosperity long denied. This sensitivity manifested during debates over urban transportation policy in the 2000s and 2010s. Proposals to reduce car usage in city centers through congestion charges, parking restrictions, or car-free zones often met stronger resistance in Eastern cities, where such measures echoed historical limitations on mobility. Environmental arguments that gained traction in Western urban areas faced skepticism from Eastern residents who had already experienced one form of mobility restriction justified by collective goals. Martin Dulig, who served as transport minister in the eastern state of Saxony from 2014, acknowledged these historical influences. When we discuss limiting car access to city centers or investing in public transportation instead of road expansion, We must recognize that these proposals land differently in regions where restricted mobility is still a living memory. The car represents more than transportation. It symbolizes the freedom to make individual choices that the GDR system denied. As Germany faced new automotive challenges in the 21st century, from digitalization to electrification to autonomous driving, these historical experiences continued to influence regional responses. Electric vehicles, with their currently limited range and higher purchase prices, initially gained slower acceptance in eastern regions, where memories of mobility constraints remained fresher. The concept of shared mobility services, rather than individual ownership, similarly encountered greater skepticism. Yet the legacy of the divided automotive cultures extended beyond these regional differences to influence Germany's national approach to transportation policy. The experience of reunifying two radically different systems heightened awareness of mobility as both a practical necessity and a profound expression of personal freedom. German policymakers proved more cautious than some European counterparts in restricting automobile usage, conscious of its symbolic importance, particularly in eastern regions. The German automotive industry, which had once exemplified the divergence between East and West, eventually became a symbol of successful reunification. Volkswagen's transformation of the former Trabant factory site in Zwickau into a modern production facility represented one of the more positive industrial transitions in the former East. By 2019, this same facility began producing electric vehicles, symbolizing not just the convergence of East and West, but the evolution toward a new automotive era. For automotive workers, this transformation created both opportunities and challenges. Former Trabant assembly line employees who successfully transitioned to Western production methods often found themselves better paid and working with superior technology. Yet the reduced workforce requirements of modern automotive manufacturing meant that many former industry workers had to find employment in entirely different sectors. Horst Weber, who worked at the Zwickau factory both before and after reunification, reflected on this transition. In the GDR days, we had job security but primitive working conditions. The factory was outdated, ergonomics were poor, and the technology hadn't changed in decades. After Volkswagen took over, everything changed. Robots doing the heaviest work, computer systems tracking every component, advanced safety equipment everywhere. But the workforce shrank dramatically. Many of my former colleagues never found stable employment again. The two-car family, once an emblem of the prosperity gap between East and West, eventually became commonplace throughout unified Germany. By 2015, approximately 27% of German households owned multiple vehicles, with regional variations showing more correlation with urban-rural differences than former East-West boundaries. What had once seemed an unimaginable luxury to East German citizens became an ordinary feature of middle-class life throughout the country. Yet even as car ownership patterns converged, the historical experience of automobile scarcity continued to influence attitudes and behaviors in subtle ways. Studies conducted decades after reunification still found that consumers raised in East Germany exhibited greater price sensitivity, longer ownership periods, and more emphasis on reliability and fuel efficiency in their automotive purchasing decisions. These persistent differences reflected the profound impact of early experiences on consumer psychology. Individuals who had grown up watching their parents wait years for basic transportation, who had witnessed the social status conferred by car ownership in a scarcity economy, who had experienced the transition from centrally planned to market-driven automobile distribution. These experiences shaped values and priorities that endured long after the systems that produced them had disappeared. For historians, the automobile divergence between East and West Germany provides a uniquely concrete measure of the different trajectories of planned and market economies during the Cold War. Unlike more abstract economic indicators, the car gap was immediately visible, emotionally resonant, and central to daily experience. The inability of the East German system to satisfy consumer demand for automobiles, despite understanding the political importance of doing so, revealed fundamental limitations that contributed to its ultimate collapse. The rapid transition from a two-car system to a unified automotive market after 1989 demonstrated both the advantages and challenges of economic convergence. The immediate consumer benefits, access to modern, reliable, and environmentally cleaner vehicles, came alongside painful industrial dislocations and cultural adjustments. The automobile industry, like German society more broadly, underwent a complex integration process that balanced transformation with preservation of distinctive regional characteristics. For individuals who lived through this transition, automobile experiences often serve as personal milestones in the reunification process. Former East Germans frequently structure their post-war narratives around vehicle ownership, the abandonment of their Trabant, the purchase of their first Western car, the normalization of mobility that had once seemed extraordinary. These individual stories, multiplied across millions of citizens, constitute the human experience of economic and political transformation. Kurt Harms, who worked as a mechanic in both East and West German systems, reflected on this transformation 40 years after the period of greatest automobile divergence. Young people today can't imagine what it meant when someone from the East first drove their own car across the border. It wasn't just about the technical differences between the vehicles, though those were enormous. It was about crossing a boundary that had defined your entire life in a machine that you owned and controlled. That feeling of agency, of self-determination, it's something that can only be understood by those who had lived without it. The two-car family, which had once represented an almost mythical level of Western prosperity to East German citizens, became simply one aspect of everyday German life. The profound gap in automobile access and quality that characterized the 1970s and 1980s gradually transformed from lived experience to historical memory. Yet this memory remains embedded in the physical landscape, in consumer behaviors, and in political sensitivities that continue to influence unified Germany decades after reunification. The legacy of the automobile gap extends beyond Germany to offer broader insights into the relationship between economic systems, material culture, and personal identity. The car, perhaps more than any other consumer good, embodied both practical utility and symbolic meaning in the context of Cold War competition. Its centrality to everyday life made automobile disparities impossible to dismiss as mere statistical differences. They represented tangible, daily reminders of the divergent paths taken by East and West. For citizens of other former Eastern Bloc countries, the German experience provided both inspiration and caution. The rapid access to Western automobile culture after 1989 demonstrated the potential benefits of economic liberalization. Yet the devaluation of Eastern products and the dislocation of domestic industries also illustrated the potential costs of too rapid transition. Each post-communist society navigated its own path toward automotive modernization, influenced by but not identical to the German model. As unified Germany approached the 30th anniversary of reunification in 2020, the automobile landscape had transformed almost beyond recognition from the divided era. Electric vehicles from manufacturers like Tesla operated alongside conventional cars on highways where Trabants once sputtered. Ride-sharing services and car-sharing platforms offered alternatives to traditional ownership models. Autonomous driving technologies promised yet another revolution in personal mobility. Yet beneath these innovations, the historical experience of automobile divergence and convergence continued to shape German society in subtle ways. Regional variations in car ownership patterns, consumer preferences, and attitudes toward mobility policy retained traces of the divided past. The collective memory of restriction and scarcity influenced political debates about environmental regulations, urban planning, and transportation infrastructure. For historians seeking to understand this period, automobiles provide uniquely valuable evidence, both as physical artifacts and as focal points for personal narratives. The Trabant and other Eastern European vehicles, preserved in museums and private collections, offer tangible connections to a vanished economic system. Oral histories centered around automobile experiences capture the emotional and psychological dimensions of division and reunification that official records often miss. Perhaps most significantly, the automobile story of divided Germany reminds us that economic systems exist not as abstract theories, but as lived realities that shape individual possibilities and constraints. The gap between East and West German automotive cultures represented not just different levels of prosperity, but different conceptions of the relationship between citizens, consumers, and the state. The two-car family, beyond its practical advantages, symbolized a social order in which individual preferences drove production decisions rather than centralized plans. The transformation of the automobile landscape in unified Germany paralleled broader social and economic changes. Just as the distinctive Trabant silhouette gradually disappeared from German roads, replaced by a diverse array of Western designs, so too did many other visible markers of division fade. Yet memory persisted in less visible ways, in driving habits, in maintenance practices, in the stories passed between generations. These stories form part of Germany's ongoing process of working through its divided past. When older Germans tell their grandchildren about the years-long wait for a simple car or the disbelief at seeing parking lots filled with private vehicles, they transmit not just historical anecdotes, but emotional experiences that shaped an entire generation's worldview. The automobile, as both practical tool and potent symbol, provides a tangible connection between abstract historical forces and intimate personal memories. In this way, the tale of two-car cultures and the eventual emergence of one unified but complex automotive landscape embodies the larger story of Germany's division and reunification. It reminds us that history happens not only in diplomatic negotiations and political pronouncements, but in the everyday experiences of ordinary citizens. The distance between East and West was measured not just in ideological differences, but in the mundane reality of how people moved through their daily lives, and the extraordinary moment when those barriers finally fell.